Count Corley, I think it is particularly appropriate that you should mention the horrors of Nagasaki and Hiroshima as we mark the first anniversary of Putin's bloody, murderous and criminal invasion of Ukraine. The United States, the biggest power in the world, in 2 days with nuclear weapons incinerated more than 300,000 people. Today, Vladimir Putin, another nuclear power, has said he's ramping up his nuclear arsenal and is considering withdrawing from the START treaty. In January, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which was set up after the horrors of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, set a thing called the Doomsday Clock. And this January, they set that clock at the closest point to midnight that it has been set since Nagasaki and Hiroshima. They set the Doomsday Clock, by which they mean the prospect of nuclear Armageddon, at 90 seconds to midnight. Largely because of the terrifying prospect of the war in Ukraine escalating to the point of the use of nuclear weapons. And it's worth considering what they said. This includes, their body includes nuclear scientists and 10 Nobel Peace Laureates. They said, the US government, its NATO allies and Ukraine have a multitude of channels for dialogue. We urge leaders to explore all of them to their fullest ability to turn back the clock. Nuclear weapons are the weapons of the psychopath. Those who used them in Nagasaki and Hiroshima were operating a psychopathic, murderous logic. Vladimir Putin has rained death and destruction on the people of Ukraine and is operating a psychopathic logic. But it is also the case that NATO, with its own bloody history, is seeking to do nothing other than escalate this conflict to the terrifying possibility that we could have a nuclear situation. Now, against that background, Taoiseach, what do you do? As the Taoiseach of a neutral country, formerly it's Taoiseach, you say now is the time to reconsider the triple lock, to review essentially our position of neutrality and deploy 30 troops to participate in the war in Ukraine, in flagrant breach of our neutral status. Just as, of course, when you were in government back in 2003, you facilitated 1 million US troops to go through Shannon Airport in order to prosecute another bloody war. Don't you think, 1 year into the war in Ukraine, the lesson is a neutral country should be using its voice on the international stage to call for peace, negotiations, and to stop the terrifying escalation of this conflict that we are witnessing, which could bring the world to the brink of conflict.
I find your remarks deeply disturbing and unfair, and inevitably in every contribution you make on the war in Ukraine, you inevitably bring it around to the NATO issue, and it's NATO's fault ultimately in your mind. And it is a disgraceful and distorted assessment of yours that you've just articulated now, that somehow NATO wants to escalate this. So I didn't interrupt you, please, now, and just allow, through the chair, allow the decency of me to make a reply. You've asserted there, in a very distorted manner, the idea that NATO wants to escalate the war on Ukraine to a nuclear status. That is a disgraceful thing to say, and it's a wrong thing to say. Germany is in NATO. France is in NATO. They did everything they could to persuade Putin not to launch that war. They were lampooned by some for endeavouring to persuade Putin not to launch that war. Why don't you accept that reality? I've been at meetings where we've been briefed in relation to the dangers in Zaporizhzhia, where you have Ukrainian citizens surrounded by Russian troops, where you've had shelling in its proximity, where internationally we have supported moves to create a zone around there, a safe zone, notwithstanding Ukrainian sovereignty, but just create a safe zone to protect or to ensure the avoidance of any untoward event happening in that particular nuclear plant. German Chancellor Scholz went to China to meet with the president there. Why? To get China to articulate unequivocally the need not to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And such a statement did emanate from the Chinese authorities in respect that there should be no nuclear dimension to this war, and Russia should not use nuclear weapons. And Russia has been the only country that has hinted, that has implied the use of nuclear weapons in the context of this war. And why? Because they're playing on the rational minds. The rational minds. And I would say this to you, the President of the United States is such a rational mind who understands the danger of this war, understands how it can spill over, understands the line he has to navigate between trying to stop this war and stop Putin's shocking attack on civilians in Ukraine. We all see it day and night. Bombing civil infrastructure, bombing energy, bombing power, bombing apartment blocks. Like the Ukrainians have a right to self-defense under the UN Charter. And if we can help with our up to 30, that's all, Deputy, to deal with demining, to deal with, and it's only training on European soil, to help them to deal with medical situations within Ukraine itself. We know from cluster munitions which Russia has used, the extraordinary damage that can do after an attack, when children go out to play and get amputated because they pick up something that doesn't look like a bomb but is a bomb. And you're saying we shouldn't help to train people to prevent that terrible impact on civilians?
Thank you, we're over time, please. Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Everybody is clear that Putin is a murderous tyrant and criminal warmonger. But I quoted the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which is made up of 10 Nobel Peace Laureates, who start by condemning Putin and then go on to urge NATO. And the problem is, Taoiseach, Taoiseach, you have a blind spot when it comes to the equally bloody history of NATO and its major powers. The United States has never apologised for the use of the nuclear weapons in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. They still believe they have the right to possess them. You say, rightly, the Ukrainian people have the right to resistance against an illegal occupation. Will you say the same about the Palestinians, where 10 of them were killed last night in Nablus in a raid by Israel in what is an illegal occupation and military intervention into land internationally designated for the Palestinians? Will you call that a war crime? Will you say that they have the right to military resistance against what Israel is doing? And of course you won't, because Israel is an ally of the United States. We will never prevent war if a neutral country has a blind spot about some of the warmongers in this world. A consistent position is opposing all nuclear powers, all warmongering powers, whether it's the tyrannical regime of Russia or whether it's NATO and the Western powers.
And the leader of the Fianna Fáil party, of whom Frank Aiken was one. First Minister for Foreign Affairs to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. My party, and indeed colleagues in government in this House, have a very proud record at the international stage in respect of nuclear disarmament and in respect of nuclear non-proliferation. And this country has a strong record in that regard, even in our most recent iteration on the Security Council of the United Nations for the last 2 years. So we don't have any blind spot about nuclear weaponry. We've been consistent. Over a decade ago we signed, and we were the leaders with Norway, with the Vatican and others, to have the international convention banning the use of cluster munitions. Ireland is well respected for its role, and well respected in respect of defending Palestinians and supporting and trying to develop a two-state solution in Palestine. And indeed it was a former Fianna Fáil Foreign Minister, the late Brian Lenihan Sr., who was the first minister in Europe to recognise Palestinians' right to a homeland. And we've been consistent in our support for a two-state solution. Ireland is one of the strongest supporters of UNRWA and has been very strong in terms of holding accountability in respect of Israeli attacks and atrocity. We condemned what happened last evening. It was wrong. And we're very, very concerned about the trend in relation to that issue. But the fundamental point is this. We stand by the international rules-based order, the United Nations Charter.
Time is up,
Putin
please.
has breached it in an appalling manner. And all we're simply saying is to help to train some Ukrainians in respect of their capability in medical combat, in terms of bomb disposal and in terms of other areas of that kind is not too great an ask for this country to make, and it does not threaten our neutrality in any shape or form, which is defined by non-military alignment. We're not members of NATO. We have no intentions or immediate plans whatsoever to join NATO.
These are tremendously emotive matters, and I understand the pressure people are under, but please, let's adhere to the time limits.